Welcome to Purple Easel Spotlight, where we put the spotlight on artists and creatives. My name's Latoya.
And I'm Megan.
And we're both art instructors here at California's largest paint and sip studio, Purple Easel.
All right, so I'm going to give you the rundown on today's artist, John James Audubon.
Audubon.
So he was a French-American. He was born in the West Indies, and he was an ornithologist.
Is that the guys that yes, I am taking down notes of birds and such?
Yes.
Okay.
They're the birders, the birders of the world. He was a naturalist, and he was a self-taught artist. We actually have somebody completely self-taught.
Yeah.
No formal training whatsoever.
Nice.
Super exciting. So he was born in the West Indies, but then he lived in France, and then at 18, he was shipped off to the United States to avoid conscription. He worked a bunch of odd jobs, like trying to run a mine and a general store. That totally failed. He was not as much of a businessman as he wanted to be. Eventually, he became a taxidermist for a while, which really came into play. And then his interest in birds just continued to grow this entire time. So much so that he would travel with a bunch of like-minded people. People who were studying flora and fauna and all kinds of different, disciplines.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And I think this particular story really kind of sums up who he was.
Oh.
So, he's sharing a little apartment with a dude. It's the middle of the night. This guy's like into fish. Okay, so his whole thing is fish. And the guy sees a bat in the apartment. He's like, oh, that looks like a new species. So I want to stun it, kill it, something.
Capture it.
But the only thing handy happened to be Audubon's violin.
Okay.
So he whaps the bat and breaks the violin. Audubon was not pleased. Also, I don't think the bat even was anything special. Nothing. And so his way of getting revenge was to later on do some drawings of some fish and then send them his way and be like, hey, I saw these. I thought you'd be interested in it. The dude takes them as real. These are not fish that actually existed. And publishes it in his work. R/pro revenge. Eddie. I mean, it was an accident.
Hey, yes.
He could have just totally messed up this dude's whole career.
Over a violin, you could just buy another one.
I mean,
Go on
I
Amazon.
assume that means he played violin. Maybe he just wanted it for decoration.
Yeah, maybe it was like something
it had
special.
sentimental value.
Like ex-girlfriend gave it to him.
Dude went hard. And that kind of describes his whole mentality in one little story.
Okay. Now, I know of him a little bit because I go to the Huntington Library. And I was like, oh, wait, I've seen his work. I know this guy kind of like when I'm besties or something. But I have seen a lot of his work that we'll get into.
Yes. So I'm going to give you a little bit more history in the rundown, and then we're going to get into the work. In order to fuel his passion, he sold small charcoal drawings. He even gave lessons to make some cash monies so he can maintain his adventure. He had hunters capture specimens for him, and then he would wire them into poses. Use his taxidermy coming into play, and then paint them while they were still fresh.
Okay.
And his goal was to paint at least a bird a day. Some larger ones would take multiple days. But as he developed his skill and got better and better, he was like, oh, this beginning stuff is trash, and redid it all.
Okay.
So this was a very, very long process. And at one point he's like, I wonder if I can actually make some money doing this instead of it just being a passion project. And he went to Europe trying to find somebody who would be willing to publish it, because they're more into stuff like that out there. And there's more resources established. This is early, 1800s in America. A lot was happening. So he found somebody, and they ended up creating hand-colored plates, copper plates. He partnered with Robert Havel, who was an engraver at the time. And Birds of America
Okay.
was born. And this is where he gets his main claim to fame.
Yeah.
It consisted of 435 hand-colored life-size prints of a bajillion bird species. And so this first image that I included shows a copper plate. And there were a couple different methods used, engraving and etching and some other ones I was unfamiliar with. But essentially, they would take the copper plate. He would copy Audubon's watercolors onto a copper plate, and then they would use that to print just the black. And then people would go back, and it was the assembly line style, just adding in a color. It was almost like screen printing, but with actual like painting.
That's cool.
So because the copper plates would lose a lot of their hard edges over use, normally there was only a run of about 200, and so that's what we had. 200 books were made, and these be big books. So I have another image that I included with a quite spiffy gentleman, but just to give you the scale of these books. And because every bird was life-size, he had to kind of work on the posing. So if like it was a really tall bird, it would be bending over catching a fish or something. So he was pretty clever in that sense. And it was just such a huge, huge undertaking.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, when I would go to the Huntington Library, I would see these ginormous birds. And the really cool thing is that everything's to scale, everything that he did. So it's really cool to see the birds and the fishes and things like this. And fishes is...
He did all kinds of stuff.
Okay, I thought so.
Mostly birds.
Yeah.
Birds was the thing.
But it's cool to me to see illustrations that are to scale.
Yeah, how often does that happen?
Exactly.
And so it took like 14 years of him traveling around doing this. And there's a movie my dad recommended to me, and it's called The Big Year. And it's really a cute, feel-good movie if you're into that. It's got Jack Black, Steve Martin, and Owen Wilson birding. And they're basically competing for who can spot the most birds in the course of a year. And it's a big thing in the birding community. And so there's basically this like competition, but it's all on the honor system. So they rarely even get photographs of these birds. They just check them off in their little books. I cannot even fathom getting a hold of these birds long enough to paint them. I guess that's why they were dead most of the time. Because having to travel around and just watching that movie and seeing how much is involved, like taking a prop plane to Alaska during a certain time of year when the birds are all nesting just to see this one kind of bird. Dude, no wonder it took them so long. He didn't have any of the modern technology that we have now. That said, there is some complaint that his work is too fanciful and that they wouldn't really be in that position. Doesn't bother me so much.
No. I wouldn't have thought of that had you not said that. I don't know. Can't you just appreciate the imagery?
I mean, it was used in a lot of scientific...
Yeah, okay.
It's right. I didn't get it if it's 100% accurate. In fact, I think there was even one bird that's like never found evidence that actually existed. And he was kind of known for some tall tales anyway. But is that really important at that point? Like, you're giving access of all these things that most people would never get to see.
No.
And at least having some general idea. And I know like he was really into accurate settings. So whatever kind of plants he included, he had a whole team of people who would help him capture scenery and do sketches and stuff. But I just think his work is extraordinary. And I can only imagine what it's like seeing it in person.
Oh, yeah. I love it. Every time I go, I have to see it. And again, to me, it's just to the scale. Even if it's a small bird, I don't know, it's more of a, I'd say like head trip. But it's cool to see the skillness. That's what gets me like, oh, wow. Even if it's small, it's just my mind's like, okay, that's literally how big that particular bird is.
It gives you a different experience.
It does.
Than just seeing a picture of it.
Yeah.
So I really liked the Carolina parrot or parakeet. It's the only native parrot in North America. Unfortunately, it's now extinct. And there's quite a few things that he captured that don't exist anymore.
Okay.
So it's like, somebody was able to go get that.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Uh-huh.
But you see, there's a lot of them in that particular picture, and he did that a lot. He included whole groups of birds instead of just one singular bird. And I love the great-footed hawk because they are basically going after their prey, and it has a certain movement to it. It's not just a bird sitting on a branch. He really concentrated on a composition, something with movement, something with feeling that is a snapshot, basically, of the real world.
Go ahead, let's see it. Let's see it.
Yes. So this is wild turkey, and it's the place of honor in the book. It's the first one.
Okay.
Because both he and Benjamin Franklin believe that the turkey should be our national bird. So next time you see a pickup truck with like the big bald eagle mural on the back, I just want you to picture a wild turkey there instead.
It's like America.
Yes.
Little babies. And see, that's again, it's so cute. It's so to scale. It's like the little cute birds. It's so cute.
Oh, and even like the nest, I'm sure that was all pretty accurate. And most people, you know, maybe you live in an area of North America where you see these all the time. Maybe they just float through your backyard. Maybe you're somewhere else entirely and you're like, wow, that actually exists here? Like, that's cool. So primarily he did watercolor. He did a bit of mixed media, so he would use some chalk or some ink or gouache. But he also did oil paintings. Now, the thing is, it's very hard to find those images because when you search for him, you're just getting all of the plates and everything that were in Birds of America. Because, I mean, it's Birds of America.
Yeah.
But speaking of Birds of America, it is one of the most valuable books in existence.
Oh, wow.
So 5 out of 10 of the most expensive books ever sold at auction were Audubon books.
Okay.
And that's with inflation adjusted and everything. He sold one for $9.6 million in 2018. Well, not him.
Oh.
He's not alive anymore, but one sold. But think about that. If only 200 were made, there's about 120 remaining. Some of them are private collectors. Some of them, mostly museums and other institutions. And you can make appointments to go view them, and they'll get out their white gloves.
Oh, yeah. I was going to
turn
say
the pages for you. Like, you don't get to just access it.
No. At the Huntington Library, it's in glass.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are a big deal.
Okay.
They're like buku bucks for these books, the first editions, because they were all made with those copper plates. And unfortunately, his widow had to sell off a bunch, and they were melted down. Right, for scrap metal. It hurts my heart. It hurts so bad. And then the New York something or other, a place in New York, has a bunch of the original watercolors that were used for the plates, which I think is super cool.
You know, one thing I think that's very, very interesting, and someone has to do it. History. I'm not like the craziest. Like science is more like my favorite topic, but I do love history. I was just saying I like science more, but yes, but it's so interesting to see how things came about. Because we need those things. Like, we need to learn for educational purposes that these are the birds of America. And going, like, it's like the maps. Someone had to go out in the sea and then figure out where things are. Someone has to go out and travel and do these things. So I think it's really, really interesting to see someone had to go out there, find these birds or plants or insects or whatever, and take note and write that down.
Yeah. It's very Darwin of him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that great unknown frontiers, unexplored. He was really marketed as like the woodsman. Like they really did him up like Davy Crockett kind of thing. And that actually brings me into a little bit of controversy. So in recent years, there has been a lot of talk about eliminating his name from like the National Audubon Society and such, because he was known to be a slaveholder and had some instances of some racist interactions, but he was also born in the West Indies and may have himself been multiracial. But he was in charge of marketing himself and getting himself out there. So he did a bunch of self-portraits to, I think, exemplify his whiteness in a world that would want that. So it's hard to know at this point really what his makeup was. And does it really matter? Because at the end of the day, his deeds kind of speak for themselves. So there were a lot of smaller chapters that scrapped his name, but I thought this was an interesting quote. On a national level, they decided to keep it. And they said, Audubon has transcended the life of John James Audubon and has become better known as a symbol of the organization's conservation work.
Okay.
And I think there's something to be said for that.
Oh yeah, no. I would keep the name. I would keep them in the history books.
It's synonymous with birds. At this point. I mean, most people don't even know that portion of his history, which I didn't until I started to research this. So
I had not known.
Here we are.
Still valid, in my opinion.
So I wanted to start with our next artist, Kiley Busko, who is also known as Painted Wing on Instagram. And this image of the heron. So we saw Audubon's heron. And I think it's kind of the coolest little story to start us off with. So she was living in Minneapolis in the middle of a big city, and she was going to MCAD, which is the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and she missed nature. She was kind of cut off from everything, and she was walking along the Mississippi River, which I used to do too when I lived out there.
Oh, well.
It's very beautiful. It actually starts in Minnesota, you know.
Oh.
Yeah, sure. But she found this heron rookery and just spent a ton of time watching these birds interact and fish, and was like, man, this is awesome. I wonder what other kind of species I can find just around, and started having this awareness all of a sudden and really kind of pursued that interest, learned a bunch of bird calls and studied some birds, and went through old books, probably Audubon included, to recreate a lot of those birds, and really found that watercolor was the perfect medium. She loved how birds had this freeness to them, and watercolor does as well. So I totally get it. It makes perfect sense to me. It's the perfect marriage.
I have so much to say about folks who do watercolor. I cannot do watercolor. I so badly want to be one of those people who can do watercolor. And it takes a light hand, and it takes, you're kind of working in like negative spaces, and you're working from like light to dark. And I think that's my problem, is I work too dark too quick. But it's the opposite of that. And I love people who can do that. It's so pretty, and it looks so elegant.
It does. And it says so much with so little. And for me, I've tried my hand at watercolor, and I like it because it's a little bit less of a commitment than sitting down with a canvas and all of your acrylics and stuff. So that part of it is appealing to me, but my stuff ends up more like Audubon. It's still really detailed. Like, I have trouble being loose. And I absolutely love how she just lets a few strokes
you can see
do the work for you. And it's still just as much like recognizable. We got the red-winged blackbird here, which maybe I wouldn't have recognized that, but she says so much with so little. I love it. And I really do think it's the perfect medium, because there's that fluidity, there's that movement that's just inherent. The birds don't need to be flying. They're just sitting on branches, but that's okay.
And speaking of movement, that's one thing I also like about watercolor is you put it down on the paper, and it's like,
yes.
And so it has this natural kind of movement, but it's a graceful kind of movement. And I think that's where there's like this elegance to watercolor.
And that was something that she, I think in an interview, had mentioned how she uses different techniques, like letting the pigment bloom or using granulated pigments to get a different effect. And I just... it's a mastery of a medium.
Yeah.
I love him.
He looks so wise, but so, not the word like cartoonish, but there's like an unseriousness, but there's a very seriousness to the owl.
Eyes are very intense.
Yeah.
But he's like, maybe I'm just a grumpy old man.
Yeah.
So
That's the vibe I'm getting.
yes, and I like that there's so much of the depth that you're getting from the colors, but then you get these little like spots on the
Yeah.
outside, and it makes it feel alive.
Yeah.
And it's just, I love it. I love it so much. And the transition between the like really detailed face,
Yeah, right?
and the nose, and then like the wing isn't super defined. It's just kind of
Doesn't need to be.
there.
Yeah.
There's just that one little claw,
Yeah.
just enough.
Whoa! Oh,
Look at all the negative space. It's your favorite is ever. We love the negative space.
Yes.
I had to include it because,
Why you can't? Like,
wow.
I don't know what to say. I just love it.
I know. I want him. It makes me want to go look at birds.
I know.
We might need to get into birding.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, I had a dream last night about birds. I didn't know about this, but I had what?
It was fortuitous.
It was. Wow. But I had a dream, like I had a little bird. Or no. One of our coworkers had a little bird, and they were like, hey, do you want to, we were in the break room. Coming back to me now.
It's in the break room.
Yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, so cute. And I wanted to keep it, and then it was like just perched, and I kept like doing one of these numbers, and it was walking around, and we were petting it. Anyways, that happened.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I love it.
This one's also very cute.
Yes, I love the wings outstretched, and just there's that little bit of negative space still, but then you get like the little flicks, and it's just proof.
Oh, ooh, classy.
It is. Classy is a good word. And it's weird to think that because watercolor is kind of a looser, less refined kind of medium, but yet,
I don't think it's
why
the
is that?
simplicity, maybe. It doesn't need a whole lot. It's very, I don't like elegant. I don't know. Not a lot. Like it's the craziest thing is you don't need a lot of detail, but there is a lot of detail.
There is, right? Like there's the use of implied lines really strong in her work, which I think I love implied lines. I like when you make the viewer kind of put connections in there. You give them just enough, and then the
brain fills them.
I think there's something about the economy of an artist using just enough, and it's like I know right now, like cottage core and the maximalist thing is really in.
Yeah.
For now, anyway. Again.
Yes.
But this in light of all of that, like it's just the total opposite. It's not so stripped down that you were like, what is but it's that
fully formed,
perfect in between.
Yes, agreed.
And then of course I just had to include a bat because a lot of Audubon's backstory is adorable.
Whacking with a violin.
How would you hit that? He's so cute.
Yeah, he is very cute.
So Audubon was considered a renowned naturalist. Like he just did great things for not only the art community, but the scientific community. And I think maybe that's part of where his popularity stems from. So it brings me to this question for you. Why is science taken more seriously than art?
I must meditate on this for a minute. Okay.
The quickest meditation ever. Go on.
I think that art is taken for granted. Much like when you go out in nature, it's there and you're like, oh wow, this feels great. Or you're at the beach, you're like, this feels great. But it's always there. It's been there. You just forgot about it. So in a way, I feel like art is so. We have the Instagrams now, and even before then, it was, you don't think about it because it's just readily there. All of like our TV shows and movies and all that stuff, you need artists to create this. You need artists even in architecture and stuff like that. So it's just so readily there to where we don't even notice it anymore. And I think maybe science is a little bit less of that. It's in the minds of people, at least. I don't know if that's a good answer or if there's any takeaways from that.
Kind of touched on something interesting. So it does kind of just fall into background noise, and you don't really notice it's there until it's not. And I'm thinking recently of writer strikes.
Yeah.
And suddenly we don't have the programming that we're used to having. And that just gives you an example. And during COVID, it was a huge thing. Like, look at all these people who are creating content for you on a regular basis that you consume. Like, you spend so much of your life consuming this content. Especially with social media now. And yet we're taking for granted the people behind it. I think part of it is the empirical nature of science, and there's a formula to it, but maybe that's why it garners a little bit more respect. But at the end of the day, both need creativity.
Yes. And we had talked about how NASA needs those creative minds to go to Mars.
I mean, and not even like we need the problem solving in order to create the technology and think outside the box and push boundaries. But just think of like back in the 50s and all the futuristic concept art. And, like Star Wars, like all the technology and the blasters and the lightsabers and like how much have we evolved as a society because we've gone, hey, that was cool. Can we actually make that happen?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
I mean, Marty McFly and his hoverboard. And my kid literally just won a hoverboard from a raffle. And the first day was a little rough. But then all of a sudden, she's just got it. And it's crazy. That wouldn't even exist if it weren't for some creative mind somewhere.
that is so true. I feel like I got a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to try to get back to the question because, yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that we create in Hollywood that we're going to see that in 5, 10, 15 years. We're going to see that very shortly, but because we had the creative minds to think of that for the said movie or show or whatever. But I will say that, and as far as like mathematics and science and art goes, I feel like they're more closely linked than what you would recognize because I was listening to NPR yesterday on the AM station, as one does. And people make fun of me before that, but thank you. The person that was speaking was a mathematician, and she was someone brought in like math and like why do you see so much math in nature, like the honeycombs that bees make, the Fibonacci sequence, flower petals and stuff like that. And so she was like, math is very mysterious, and we don't have the answers, but that within itself is why we do what we do as mathematicians. But there's a creativeness to all of that. So I feel like even though I'm doing this as if something. Connection. I don't know. So even though we like to think of like science, math, and art as something very separate, they're all kind of linked in a way.
They are very closely linked, and I think people take it for granted. And there's that capitalist society creeping in again and saying you can make money going into the sciences, but you can't make money as an artist.
Exactly.
And that's where our value is. So art and science both seek to explain humanity.
Yes.
And create a further understanding of life on Earth. And I think that is the common denominator that you need to keep in mind when you go out into the world. Look for ways that art and science overlap.
Yeah.
And I think all of a sudden you're going to realize that there's creativity everywhere, and that's when you can start to tap into it.
Yes, and both science and arts has to deal with observations. We wouldn't have anything that we have in art if we did not observe it, the way the light bounces off of objects. There is a science to the things that we learn here in art, in the art world as well. And both have an observable, what happens when this reacts with this sort of kind of element to it.
Hypothesis, the scientific method. Yeah, it's all observation. So take some time, let us know what are some things outside that you have observed that have really helped you either find some peace or create art or just like exist. I don't know.
Yes, definitely comment below. And from all of us here at Purple Easel, thank you so much for tuning in.
Make sure to check out more information on today's artists, John James Audubon and Kiley Busko, in the links below.
Join us at purpleeaselplus.com to paint with the world's largest paint sub studio online.
And if you're in Southern California, make sure to swing by the studio. In the meantime, create more and create often.
Bye. Audubon, 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 Audubon. That sounds like a Pokemon. Audubon, Audubon. Kind of like Cubone, Cubone.